So these first few questions have to do with how a register works and how the signal gets transmitted from flip-flop to flip-flop, because it doesn't happen instantaneously. So we're assuming that all the Q outputs begin in the low state. So when we start, Q for each of these flip-flops is 0. So all of those are 0. And then the flip-flop is only going to change its value. It's a positive edge triggered flip-flop, so it's only going to change its value at the positive edge of the clock. Now VDD, that's going to be high, so that's like a 1. So we've got this 1 signal coming in continuously. So the 1 is coming in to the first D flip-flop. So when we get to the first positive clock edge, this flip-flop here, Q, this is numbered. You never know when you get something, when you get a problem, what direction they're going to be numbered. And there's a reason for that. There are some things in computers and computer science that go, they call them big Indian or little Indian, that go in this direction, 0, 1, 2, 3, and others that go 0, 1, 2, 3, and you'll see both of them on this handout depending on who it was who made the problem. Okay, so flip-flop Q0 gets this 1 signal, so it's going to change to 1, so it'll go to high. But when this clock changed, the Q on flip-flop 0 was still 0, and that's what flip-flop 1 over here sees, is the 0 that was here before. And so these are always going to see the value from the clock cycle before. So Q1 does not change. Q2 likewise does not change, and nor does Q3, because they still all have a 0 sitting at their input. And then we're not going to have another change until we get to the next positive edge. Well, this 0th flip-flop has a continuous signal of 1 coming in. So it's never going to change again. It'll stay at 1. But when we get to this next positive edge of the clock, flip-flop number 1 here looks at what D is, and D is the value that the flip-flop before had, which was 1. So now Q1 can change to 1.
And it doesn't do that till the next positive side of the clock, right?
That's right. But then, since Q0 now always has 1, hey, how are you? Please help yourself to cookies and do sign the sign-in sheet. Okay. And those of you who are watching this online, no cookies for you. So Q1 now is always going to have the signal from Q0, which we determined was always going to be 1. So Q1, once it changes to 1, is also not going to change. But Q2, at this second positive edge here, right here, when that happened, Q1 was still 0. And so Q2 is going to stay 0 until it gets to the next positive edge, which is right here. And when it gets to the next positive edge, it will look and see what was Q1 before. It always has to look at what it was before, because it's not going to change. The next one's not going to change until the first one has had a chance to go through the whole clock cycle. So here it looks before, and now it is a 1. So it can go up to 1, and it'll stay 1. And you can probably guess what Q3 is going to do. So at the first clock cycle, it looks at Q2 and it's 0. At the second clock cycle, it looks at Q2 and it's still 0. At the third clock cycle, it looks at Q2 and sees that it's 1, so now it can become 1. Would you like a blank handout? Oh, would you like a sticker? Does anyone want? What'd you get? Oh, yeah. Okay, so now we're going to look at the next one, which I think, is it question 2 on y'all's? Yeah, question 2, yeah. Okay, because sometimes I misnumber them. You know, they can be 1, 3, 7, go back to 2. Remember that we always have to be looking at what the input was from the clock cycle before. So we are assuming they all start at 0. So right now, all of the cues for all of the flip-flops are 0. We're going to call this one 0, this one 1, this one 2, and this one 3. Now this one's different. The one we just did a minute ago, we had a continuous input of 1. Now this time, our input is Q bar. And so our input, right now when we get to the positive clock edge, what's sitting right there waiting to come in is 1, because Q was 0. Q was 0, so its complement is 1, and D flip-flops, the output follows the input, so if it has a 1 sitting up here, it's going to become a 1, and so it'll go up to 1, and it'll stay there until the next positive clock edge, because they only change at the positive clock edge. Now, notice that flip-flops 1, 2, and 3 get their input from the flip-flop before it. So they don't have this negative input coming in. I'm going to stick with Q0 right now, and then we'll come in and fill the others. Okay, so from this positive clock edge, we got Q was going to be 1. That means Q bar is going to be 0. And so the next time the clock edge comes around, it's going to be 0. So it'll go back to 0, and it'll stay that way until you get to the next clock edge. But now, since Q is 0, Q bar is 1, and so it has the input of 1, and so it'll go back up to 1. And it's just going to keep alternating like that, because each time its input is the complement of what the output was the time before. Okay, now we'll go to Q1, and now even if you missed the beginning of the first problem, it kind of reviews it here. So if we look at Q1, when we get to the first clock edge, it has to look at what the input was from the clock cycle before. So Q started at 0, and so it's not looking at the fact that Q just changed to 1. It's looking at the fact that Q was 0. And so it's going to be 0 to the next clock cycle. And then it'll look at what Q was before, because its input, the flip-flop 1, its input is the output from flip-flop 0. Its input is Q0, but it's the input from, it's the output from the time before. And so from the time before, it was 1. And so its output is always going to be the complement of Q0 because it's one step behind. Now, Q2 will be looking at Q1. So for the first clock cycle, it sees that Q1 is 0, so it stays 0. For the second clock cycle, it looks at what Q1 was before the clock changed. Before the clock changed, Q1 was 0, so it's going to stay 0. But when we get to the next positive edge of the clock, when it looks back to see what Q1 was 1, so it'll become 1. And then from then out, it's going to be the mirror image of Q1. So you can probably guess what this last one is going to be now. So for the first clock cycle, Q3 sees that Q2 was 0. For the second clock cycle, it sees that Q2 was 0 in the first clock cycle. For the third clock cycle, it sees that Q2 was 0 during the second clock cycle. And now when it gets to the next one, when it looks back, it sees that it was 1. And then we'll have this pattern. So what we have is this kind of ripple effect that D, so Q follows D. If you have D flip-flops, Q is going to do whatever D does. And so with our first one that we had, the input was 1, so you would think that, well, Q is going to be 1. But it takes a little while to get all the way to register 3. And then here, our first one is going back and forth between 0 and 1, and it takes a little while for that pattern to percolate through, but then once it does, it's always opposite from the one that came before. Okay, so let's see this next one. Complete the timing diagram for the circuit showing all propagation delays for all flip-flops, delay times much less than the width of the clock pulse. So before, we were saying things happened exactly on the clock edge. Well, they don't happen exactly on the clock edge. They happen a little bit before that, a little bit after that. So let's see what we have here. Assume all Q outputs begin in the low state. All right. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3. And the input for Q's for register 0 is number 1 bar, the complement. And so if we follow this here, we know that Q was originally 0. Well, Q bar then is going to be 1. So when we get to the first clock cycle, Q0 is going to be 1, but this time we're supposed to give it a slight bit of a delay, which you can't really see there. There's just a little bitty bit of a space there. And it'll stay that way till we get to the next positive edge. Okay, so so 1, so flip-flop number 1 here has its input Q0. So Q0 from the clock cycle before was 0. So Oh, that's not good. OneNote is so finicky. Let's try this again. Okay, so Q1 is looking at Q0. Before the clock change, Q0 is 0, so Q1 will stay 0. So I'm going down. I'm not doing a whole flip-flop all the way through because this one is a little bit more confusing. I want to make sure I do clock cycle by clock cycle. And so we see that when we start, so this was 0, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, and 3 all have a 0 sitting up here waiting to come through. So for the first clock cycle, it'll all be 0. Except for Q0, which got a 1. Okay, so now let's see what happens on the next clock cycle. So into Q0, we're going to have the complement of Q1. Now, Q1 was 0. The time before it was 0. So its complement is still 1. So Q0 will still be 1. And that's because Q1 didn't change. But now, Q1 is going to change because when Q1 looks to see what Q0 was right before the clock, Q0 was 1. So it's going to become 1, and I'm going to come out a little bit past the clock edge to show the delay. Q2, on the other hand, hasn't had a chance to see a 1 yet. It looks back, it still sees a 0, so it'll stay 0. And so will Q3. But now, Q1 was 1, so Q1 bar is 0. Since Q1 bar is 0, that means that's the input that flip-flop number 0 sees, so it's going to become 0. But Q1 still sees the 1 from the time before. It doesn't see this new 0 that's coming up, so it's going to stay 1. Q2 now finally sees that 1 that was trickling through, so it will become 1. But Q3 is still 0 because Q2 was still 0. And then in our last clock cycle, let's see. So Q0 is going to look at Q1. Q1 was 1. Q1 bar is 0, so it'll stay 0. Q1 is going to look at 0, and it will see that it was a 0, so it'll go back down to 0. Q2 will look at Q1, which was 1, so it'll stay 1, and Q3 finally gets its chance to be 1.